Hello, everybody. It's me, your boy Cryptid. So we have this funny little fellow on the internet called HC Casual, and he has a very burning question that needs to be answered, or at least talked about. He's worried that ZZZ's combat may be better than Wuthering Waves. Now, I want to know what his thought processes about it, because they essentially have the same sort of combat, just a different way of implementing it. They both have parries, they both have dodges. It's just the parry system for Zenless Zone Zero is based off of switching in and out, while the parry system for Wuthering Waves is timing your attacks. Specifically, you don't have to switch in and out at all. But if you boil it down, essentially the same base mechanics for both combats. So I want to see what his experience is with which one's better or not.
Hey, it's your resident combo-obsessed bestie, here to say, nah, the title isn't rage bait. I'm genuinely worried, because a few months ago, I would have said Wuthering Waves and Zenless were on equal footing when it comes to their combat. But
that is what I personally think. I think they have very good combats that suit the different gameplay and different settings that they have. I feel like it's all right for them to have slightly different combats, but I feel like they both they want you to parry at right times, they want you to dodge and everything to that effect. I feel like they both have very solid combat.
that was around launch, before I'd spent hundreds of hours with both games. Now, however, I'm not so sure, because I've been struggling with the fact that something about Wuthering Waves combat just doesn't feel quite right. My head says I should love Wuthering Waves a lot more than I do. I mean, in theory, it's right up my alley, but my heart has just never been in it. And I've
No, I wonder why that is. I wonder why that is, because I personally I have such a fun time doing Wuthering Waves combat. I never feel like I'm being gated by not having a new character or anything to that effect. Which sometimes in Zenless Zone Zero I feel a little gated. If you don't have a very strong element of the one that they're focusing on, feels a little bit gated, but not too much.
had a single question rattling around my brain driving me crazy for months. Like, why is it that even though on paper Wuthering Waves has more depth than ZZZ, in the practice the combat feels less cohesive? And the more I've thought about that gut feeling that something is wrong here, knowing myself and the lifetime I've spent playing games like these, I have to wonder if what's causing that feeling is the possibility that Zenless's combat is just flat out better than Wuthering Waves on some level. In so many other ways, Wuthering Waves is beyond brilliant. It's the Marvel Rivals, the Genshin's Overwatch. It's like everything I know I've been asking for years.
That is a crazy comparison because it makes total sense. No matter how you feel about it, I played Overwatch for a long time, played it since it came out. Fell out of love with it when they started making false promises and just trashing the game entirely. And I am currently playing Marvel Rivals. So I feel that kind of comparison, and it makes a lot of sense. It really does.
It's certainly not a 10, and neither is Zenless, but Wuthering Waves is a very good game, and for a decent amount of my friends, honestly, I'd recommend it over Zenless, because, you know, Zenless is great, obviously I'm a fan, but it's still way too much of a capital G gacha game, whereas Wuwa is progressively feeling more like a game that just happens to be a gacha.
That was what I was saying with the whole gated on the having certain elements, because I have played both these games since release. And even if I don't pull the character I want on Wuthering Waves, I feel like it's less so that it's less so impactful on the actual gameplay than it is just me wanting a character. Because I've been clearing most content with just 2 characters, really. I mean, having a supportive team and everything like that. But I feel like with Zenless Zone Zero, they really focus on, well, if you don't have this type, you're basically going to be at a severe disadvantage, and I hope you grinded good enough relics to overcome that. I get what he's saying with the capital G, 100%.
The fact that it's a vibrant open world as opposed to a menu simulator definitely helps, but I'm realizing the combat is maybe one of the biggest factors holding back some of its true potential, which probably sounds wild to some of you, because Wuthering Waves combat does feel great and absolutely has more room for the kind of player expression that normally defines character action games, while Zenless is a bit more limited. But have you ever heard the saying, constraints breed creativity? Sometimes the more limitations you have, the more innovative your solutions become, and the Zenless devs have made a few design decisions around their limitations that may be some of the most quietly innovative I've seen in any action game in years. Surprisingly, they've actually managed to find that rare balance between a high skill ceiling and a low skill floor with combat that can be fun and engaging for all skill levels. And that's something action games like this have always struggled with, and more often than not, you get games that are so afraid of pushing away the casual audience they wind up feeling shallow like FF16, or too overwhelming to be very approachable for the average gamer like Devil May Cry.
I do agree with them. Both combat systems are super fun and pretty interactive. I've never felt bored fighting things in Zenless Zone Zero. Never felt bored because I always feel like I'm doing something. I always feel like the protagonist. No matter which character I'm playing, I always feel like I am him. I always feel like I'm doing a lot. I'm doing a lot of damage. I'm having fun. I'm trying my best. I never feel like that no matter what I do, I just cannot do anything. It's just more so how much damage they're absorbing rather than what I'm doing, if that makes any sense.
I've been looking for the perfect gateway game for the longest time, a game that can introduce people to some of the unique satisfaction of stylish character action games, that can smooth over some of the less approachable edges to make it more welcoming for newcomers and casual fans of the genre, while not losing sight of what makes these games so much fun for those of us who love exploring the depth in these combat sandboxes, and I think I may have finally found it in Zenless, while on the other hand, Wuthering Waves feels a bit lacking. Which is where part of my concern comes from, because again, I do like Wuthering Waves, it is a really good game, but the difference between a good game and a truly great one is often a matter of degrees. So even though I feel like Wuthering Waves isn't quite there yet, it's really hard to put a finger on precisely where it's coming up short. And
so I actually really agree with that, because it does feel like Zenless Zone Zero has an easier intro and entry to the game in general. It feels like it's more accessible to newer players, while Wuthering Waves, it's a lot to deal with. They throw a lot at you at once, so if you're not used to open world games or the kind of fighting style that they have, it is a lot to absorb, because you can spend hundreds of hours and still not get anything done in this game. There is so much to explore, especially with 2.0 that just came out. There's so much to do. While if you look at Zenless Zone Zero, it's confined to very small areas, so you can explore that in like 10-15 minutes tops, and then you just do your dailies or your little quests or mini games or whatever you have to do, and you're done. While Wuthering Waves, you can get absorbed into it, and it's just a lot to process.
And it's been hard to say if I actually love what Wuthering Waves is, or simply what I think it has the potential to one day become. So part of me fears this could be yet another one of those action games that lingers on the edge of greatness forever without ever truly living up to it, which would be tragic. But vague fears aren't really helpful, so it's time to get to the bottom of where the line is. Time to figure out what precisely separates good character action games from truly great ones.
Let me hear.
So hi, hello, Hecky G everyone, call me Casual. Welcome to the first in a series of videos where we'll be holding a magnifying glass up to the nuances of combat and two of the best and most accessible newcomers to grace the character action scene in years, to determine who's truly got the sauce to be the next genre-defining legend. The fact that they both happen to be gacha games is, mildly painful, but so was Final Fantasy 16 and Bayo 3 for that matter, so beggars can't be choosers. But in a way, it does only make everything these games bring to the table with their combat all the more impressive, and I'll say now that I've started putting serious thought into answering the question of the hour, I've got a vague idea of what the answer might be, and it's not the one I expected. Funny enough, I think a lot of the biggest hiccups in Wuthering Waves are thanks to some of the most seemingly innocent aspects of the game mechanics that I believe are holding back a lot of the game's potential. Mechanics that make the combat feel dull and
maybe I'm gonna take a guess. Maybe the lock behind the concerto system, or how some characters they feel like you need certain characters. Like let's take the new character for Carlotta. It feels like if you don't have Jeji, your only option of a support character is Tao Chi. Or Tao Ki, however you pronounce that name. Now, if you've never played this character, it is a very slow gameplay. And essentially what I found out is you kind of do your skill ultimate, put a absolute buttload of energy regen on her. Do your skill ultimate, and just you have to switch to her twice to get the 3 procs on her forte, just to even try and get her concerto up. It is a lot to do, and then during that entire time, because you have to put so much energy regen on her to get her ultimate up all the time, she does nothing. I mean, she does nothing to begin with, but she absolutely just tickles the enemy with hundreds of damage instead of the 100,000 that my other characters do. And then because of having different healers and everything like that, we haven't really had a really good third healer. I'm using Baiji on her for the frost enhancement, and that character is also pretty bad as well. It just feels rough when some characters, they come out but they have no support relating to the character. It just feels a little rough
and repetitive, when by all rights this should be one of the hypest games on the market. So today's going to be the first of many discussions as we take a closer look at Wuthering Waves versus Zenless Zone Zero's combat mechanics and talk about how little differences go a long way when it comes to why one of these games is already starting to feel a bit stale. And look, I know, especially in the gacha community, head-to-head comparisons like this can be frowned upon sometimes. There's a prevailing...
Yeah, we just gotta have a huge thing with gacha tribalism, so yeah, this is gonna be a firecracker. In the fire right now.
And among some, that games should stand on their own, right? Some people think if you like or dislike something, you should be able to discuss your fun or your criticism within the context of the game.
You're not allowed to have your own opinions. If you don't like something, keep it bottled up. I don't want to hear it.
Criticizing, and not through comparisons to the industry or other games around it. And I get where some of that energy comes from. There are absolutely people out there who will uplift one thing just to drag another down, especially where these companies are concerned, but that's very much not what I'm here to do today. One of the things I've learned in life is, to an extent, you have to compare everything if you want to properly understand anything. I mean, comparing and dissecting what makes things work, what doesn't, and why is one of the best tactics humans have for gaining a better understanding of the world around us. None of us knows everything, and the simple fact of the matter is learning requires explanation.
Let's see, he says none of us knows everything. He's obviously never talked to professional gacha players. They know a lot more than everything. They know everything times 2, all right? So you need to get your facts straight, bud.
Explanations, and more often than not, explanations require comparisons. Personally, I know simply going through the process of looking at these games side by side has already given me a better perspective of my own preferences and why I enjoy the kinds of games that I do. And I just think that kind of introspection can be helpful to all of us sometimes. If for no other reason than be able to confidently explain why you like or dislike things beyond just saying, well, this sucks and I hate it. I mean, I could certainly just say, cooldowns suck and I hate them, and I doubt I'd be entirely alone, but I just think my point might come across better by
actually, I love cooldowns because they add to the gameplay rhythm, and it takes real skill if you play with cooldowns, actually.
Comparing how the passive gameplay cooldowns inspire makes this game less engaging, while the active decision-making, resource-backed mechanics like special energy encourage are part of what's keeping me hooked to this game. Comparisons are crucial because they're often almost necessary to provide the context to truly understand not just other people's perspectives, but often your own. And of course, we're not just here to compare Zenless and Wuthering Waves. I mean, that's going to be our focus because I think most of us here are familiar with at least one of these games, so they'll be easiest to talk about. But we are going to
2 of the biggest gacha games to date.
Be making a lot of comparisons across the entire industry. Because in my opinion, looking at the whole instead of laser focusing on individual parts is the only way to have any true perspective. And it's one of the best ways to give legitimately productive feedback beyond just saying, well, just, make the game better. So please know, my comparisons are always for the sake of more effective communication and furthering my own understanding, not trying to start the next Toyo Kuro war in the comments. I apologize for the disclaimer, but if you watch a lot of gacha content,
see, that's just no fun. Starting wars is the best part of the gacha community.
And you know exactly why it was probably necessary, especially considering I'm about to say a lot of pretty controversial things across this series of videos, because I'm not going to pull a single punch. We're going to talk about the unique ways these games handle their team building, their quick swapping, why mechanics like Anomaly are underrated, and why mechanics like Concerto are a nightmare, why both of these games seem to be racing to create the same roguelike, and of course, the problem with this parry, and so much more. All with the focus on moment-to-moment gameplay and fun, not the meta, but that's a lot to discuss in one video, so
I cannot wait for him to tear both these games apart, because just to reiterate, I play and love both these games. But once we open up the what makes the games feel not so fun, then we can improve upon the games and make more people like the games.
Obviously, we're going to spread it out a bit. Today, though, I figured I better come out swinging to give you a taste of why part of me feels like Zenless might be a full tier above Wuthering Waves instead of just a different flavor of fun, starting with one of the biggest reasons I've played way more Zenless than Wuthering Waves over the past several months. Because this is one of those mechanics that's like a large part of what's currently making Wuthering Waves feel like a game that encourages kind of boring memorization and repetition, while Zenless feels like a game that encourages really engaging reactivity and adaptability. So without further ado, have you ever asked yourself why cooldowns exist?
You wouldn't refuse me, would you?
I want everybody, before we go on with this, I want everybody to comment down below why you think cooldowns exist. Like, what's the purpose of cooldowns?
In a lot of circumstances, cooldowns are there for the sake of balancing gameplay. They ensure players can't spam really powerful abilities constantly, but sometimes when it comes to character action games like Wuthering Waves in particular, they can also be an accessibility feature. One of the big barriers of entry with games like Devil May Cry is in a vacuum, handing a regular person the insanity that is Dante's 8-ish weapon moveset plus all his stances, his installs, and everything is like handing someone a blank piece of paper and saying, hey, draw me something cool. And that's so vague, most people wouldn't even know where to start. I mean, too many options can be paralyzing after all, so best case, you're just getting a lot of those S's people used to draw in middle school. Which is likely why when Ryota Suzuki...
See, you were obviously the cool kid if you drew those S's. That was how you weeded out the cool kids from the nerds.
The design lead for Devil May Cry 5 went to work on Final Fantasy 16, he didn't just simplify things a little bit, he and his team shifted a lot of the traditional moveset to a series of cooldown abilities, reducing the amount players had to worry about at any given time. And that did come at a cost, which we'll get to in a moment, but I've seen a lot of feedback from people who could never quite wrap their head around DMC on how much fun they had with FF16, because not only is the moveset like a fifth of the size, but the cooldowns give you structure to play around. Instead of a blank piece of paper, cooldowns can be like a coloring book for combat. Cooldowns make it easier to build a clear order of operations to approach each fight with based on which abilities are on and off cooldown to keep the damage flowing in, and that's what a lot of people do in games like Wuthering Waves.
Yeah, if we didn't have cooldowns, everybody would just be spamming one move, and it would just look boring and just unfun. But with the access of cooldowns, you have different abilities. With the different abilities, you change it up. You have a rotation. You know what to do, what not to do. It makes it fun. It makes it interactive to be able to use all your abilities instead of just I hit my one button, I do big damage, and I have fun. Like, of course, having cooldowns is a great thing. If a game came out and had no cooldowns, it would get boring immediately. Like, what would you do?
And in this case in particular, I'd argue that's clearly what the devs want us to do, because Wuthering Waves cooldowns are like tightly wound synchronized clocks, and characters are very clearly balanced with how their cooldowns will match up with the rest of their team as well as the kind of enemies you'll be fighting in mind. So as long as you're following a combo rotation, your skills will more or less be available whenever you need them, avoiding a massive pitfall a lot of other action games that integrate too many cooldowns fall into. You see, in a lot of games like Relink and FF16, often the balance feels way off. The cooldowns take forever to refresh and enemies are fairly tanky, so you wind up spending a lot of your time basic attack.
Yes, I totally agree. With having cooldowns is a very big necessity, but having too long of cooldowns makes the game feel like a slog. You have to have that right amount of I finish this skill, then I do this skill, and then I do the third skill, and by the time I'm done with the third skill, the first skill is back up, and create a nice flow of rotations. If you're just like, I used all my skills, and now I just kind of auto-attack for a little bit, it's just terrible.
Acting while you sit around twiddling your thumbs, waiting on all your timers. The cooldowns are so long that they heavily discourage using your abilities when you want to and encourage saving them for when you might need to later. And this is where I really do have a lot of appreciation for the way Wuthering Waves handles theirs. I mean, I would certainly prefer it if a lot of these cooldowns were shorter. Like, please, just cut the grappling hook in half, right? But I think there is a decent balance between abilities that require cooldowns like character skills, ultimates, and echoes, and abilities powered by resource generation like Forte skills. The Forte skills in particular being one of this game's master strokes, because giving each and every character their own unique mechanic like Sanhwa's rhythm minigame adds a fun layer of depth, so you're not just passively waiting on cooldowns, and each character has their own goals to accomplish to an extent.
I do truly love how every Forte just has their own little thing. I hope they implement more things like the Sanhwa rhythm game to make it more interactive instead of just building a bar then expelling the bar. her, you build a bar, but you also have to sit there and time your attack, and just the more bar you build, just the easier it is. They need to do more like that. They need to have more innovative strategies with the Forte, I think.
Extent. Which is why when it comes to just casually roaming the open world, I think the cooldowns aren't really the biggest issue. I mean, certainly not in the way they are in Final Fantasy. Aside from how Concerto kind of throws a wrench in everything, which we'll get into another time. But like aside from that, I think the open world casual combat loop is a lot of fun. It's really strong because the devs left plenty of room for variety and flexibility when it comes to skill expression.
I do think, it's funny he paused at the same time. I do think to fix the Concerto thing, they need to implement more weapons that add or build up Concerto, because I feel like right now those weapons are just idolized. You just need to spread it out, or at least sprinkle a little bit of Concerto in the newer weapons that get released, just so it speeds up the gameplay a little bit, because just sitting there waiting for your Concerto to build while it's taking so long to do, it doesn't feel good at all.
The problem is, it all kind of falls apart as soon as you want or need to play efficiently on any level. Very broadly speaking, in gacha games, there's generally two types of combat encounters. Casual ones, where as long as you have the bare minimum stats and know how to play the game, you have nothing to really worry about, like the average open world fight.
The trash mobs
and
of the
serious
world.
ones where even if you have the gear, you'll need to fully utilize the potential of your entire team to get the job done, like you'll see in most in-game activities and lengthier elite and boss encounters. Now, if you're anything like me, a primarily free-to-play player who doesn't have character duplicates or a ton of shiny premium weapons and hasn't had the best of luck gambling for stats, you'll know that for those more serious fights, efficiency is beyond crucial, because odds are, one way or another, you're likely going into them at a slight disadvantage. Which is where the problem stems from, because you know how I mentioned Wuthering Waves cooldowns are tightly wound, so if they're using an entire team effectively, the abilities you need will more or less be off cooldown when you need them? The problem is the cooldowns are actually a little too tightly wound, so if you don't follow a rotation, hell, even if you spend too much time dodging or parrying attacks, you can easily ruin your entire damage output. You may have noticed in a lot of the footage I've shown you today...
See, I've heard a couple people say this. I feel like that's part of it, is like perfecting the rotation, knowing when your players, because you only have 3 people on a team, just knowing your cooldowns and such, is being able to adapt. Not just being able to follow, well, I do this, this, and this, and then, but if I gotta dodge, what do I do then? It's being able to adapt. It's like knowing a base rotation, but also being able to know, well, I gotta dodge this, I gotta dodge this. This boss has a super high attack pattern, so I'm not gonna be able to do all of these specifically. What I need to do is get my Concerto up. Oh, I get more Concerto by dodging more, so I'm just going to do what I need to do in the middle, get my Concerto up, and then switch to my main DPS with my intro skill, and so on and so forth. It's all about adaptability. I get what he's saying, but it's all about adaptability and knowing when to do your skills and when to dodge.
Every time I need to deal proper damage, fights start to look kinda samey, to the point where, from a gameplay perspective, they somewhat blend together. It's the same loop of Carlotta into Shorekeeper into Yang Yang back to Carlotta and repeat, with like minor variations based on where my Concerto is at or if I'm starting the fight without my ults ready. And I have to finish that rotation relatively quickly or I'll miss out on a pretty sizable chunk of my damage, resulting in the exact same problem that makes Genshin Impact's combat kind of a snooze fest. Because being effective requires using all your cooldowns in a fairly strict order of operations, requiring you to use a fairly strict rotation to properly line up all your buffs and whatnot, I more or less know what every fight is going to look like before it even starts, and as a result, combat starts to feel kind of repetitive. Especially considering this is a game where you're usually going to be highly reliant on your buffs for dealing damage, and many of those buffs have their own cooldowns attached. Not to mention, a lot of those buffs can only be passed to the next character coming on field, or they tend to get lost as soon as that character swaps back off field, and the game rarely shows you all of your active buffs in the first.
I do think that the intro skill buffs where it's only to the next person on the field, and once you switch, you're done. I feel like they need to add more of team-wide buffs to enable quick swap, because I feel like I get what he's saying, because it's how it is now. Quick swap, yes, it is a thing, but it's not as widely used as the other very slow, very methodical, I do this, this, and this, and then do burst, and then do this, this, and this. when we get more characters that enable quick swap, I think more people will start gradually switching over to that, and it'll be a this or that type of situation, because now there is quick swap with Zhang Liao and Chang Li, and then Zhang Liao and Carlotta, but we'll it's essentially just Zhang Liao and somebody else. Once we get more DPS that thrive on quick swap, more supports that thrive on quick swap, I feel like this slow, methodical, boring playstyle that he's talking about will slowly start merging over to something more dynamic.
Place, making them hard to keep
if that
track
makes
of.
any sense.
I don't know about you, but I don't want to have to keep tabs of a bunch of invisible timers in my head while I'm trying to go toe-to-toe with Crownless. So at all times, I feel like kind of boxed in by the devs because they just insist you approach fights with relatively rigid combos and strategies if you want to do well. To be fair, there's absolutely more nuance to the rotations in Wuthering Waves than there is in Genshin.
Which he's using quick swap right now, so there's not really a rotation in quick swap. It's just kind of, you just throw your abilities out and just do damage as fast as possible. So
got a lot of love and respect for how much additional room
there's a little bit, but it's just essentially just knowing what skills you have. There's not a set rotation like it is with intro skills.
There is for player expression when it comes to creating your own rotation that suits your personal playstyle preference as opposed to purely what's most optimal. For example, even though I love Yang Yang, she's not Carlotta's ideal partner, but because she's one of my favorite characters, I'm able to comfortably shift the way I use my Carlotta to adapt to.
She is a good substitute if you don't want to use Tao Pi or have Zheshi. She is a good substitute just for the energy regen, but there are better ones.
Integrating Yang squared into my rotations. That's great, but it doesn't make the core experience any less repetitive. You still kind of have to follow a rotation, you just have more options when it comes to finding your own. So I mean, it will take longer to get bored of, but I don't entirely hate cooldowns in theory, and I don't think they're all bad even in this game, but the closer I look, the harder it feels to ignore all the stifled potential for variety in moment-to-moment gameplay, largely driven by all the, in my opinion, unnecessary limitations in Wuthering Waves, especially the cooldown. And since I've been playing a lot of not just ZZZ, but PoE, I can't help but think about how much more fun Wuthering Waves would be if they traded most of the cooldowns for resource-backed systems like special energy or mana. Because the thing about cooldowns,
I would be pretty positive towards that if they added some other characters that had a building mana gauge or fury gauge or whatever to use your abilities, just like they do in Diablo. Just the barbarian, you have one that builds up the fury and just one that just dumps fury like crazy. I wouldn't be opposed to a couple of characters like that. I feel like that's a great idea.
More often than not, they wind up removing a certain layer of player choice. Because you can use abilities freely in PoE as long as you have the mana, your choices are much more about which abilities to use when based on your personal preference, playstyle, and the situation at hand, not just how they support your DPS. And so despite the fact that I'm often using the same set of 6 or 7 abilities, every fight still looks and feels fresh because the way I use those abilities is constantly shifting because mana gives you the gameplay flexibility to allow for that, instead of focusing purely on output, and so does special energy. The fact that this is a resource and I'm constantly making decisions not just about how to spend it, but also how to regain it is a crucial element of the decision making that keeps games like this fun long term in my opinion. Whether we're talking about combo-centric games like Devil May Cry or ARPGs like Path of Exile, in my opinion, one of the big differentiators between a quality experience I'll keep coming back to for years and something I know I'll wind up putting down one day out of boredom is a degree of nuance in decision-making in combat, not just at the start of every fight, but in every single button press before you finish it. In almost every video I've made so far, I've talked about how much I love the fact that Zenless is a game about combo routes, not rotations. If I go into 10 fights with one of my Miyabi Yanagi teams, all 10 are going to play out very differently because I'll be making different decisions in each and every single one, largely thanks to the fact that a resource like special energy allows for more situational decision making than cool.
Arguably, I feel like he's hard capping on that, honestly, because you're essentially gonna have the same type of rotation, like you do for Wuthering Waves in Zenless Zone Zero. You're gonna go in, use your abilities in a certain way. It's not like your energy regen fluctuates. Yes, they don't have a cooldown system, but it's a pseudo cooldown system because you're not really gonna use your skill except with certain characters like Yanagi. You're not gonna use your skill unless it's glowing. And so you use that, and then you wait for it to glow again, and then you use that, and then you wait for it to use that. It is a pseudo cooldown timer. It may not have like a counting from 10 to 0, but you're really not going to do anything else besides build up that energy and just wait for that to glow, that button to glow. Now, unless you're doing things like the roguelike mode where your stats vary for different times you're doing it. You're pretty much going to do the same rotation, do the same attacks and everything. It's pretty much going to be the exact same. I don't know why he would be doing something and do it completely different each time he does it, when there would be an efficient, optimal way of doing it.
Cooldowns do. Throughout every fight, I'm making decisions like which stance to use with Yanagi, not just driven by my buffs, but based on which is best suited to countering the enemy in front of me. I'm using Bernice's special attack not just for damage and anomaly buildup, but for the sake of dancing in and out of the iframes to keep my characters safe. I'm priming bosses with Miyabi, prepping them so I can guarantee a freeze right before they would recover from stun, so I can give myself enough time to land a second tactical nuke and close out the fight. And for better or for worse, I think this stun DPS phase is kind of the perfect example of where the core difference between Wuthering Waves and Zenless is, because the stun DPS phase is where Zenless's combos can also get a lot more rigid. You've got a very small window of time to dish out the bulk of your damage after all, and so especially with burst DPS characters like Juyen, you kinda have to use fairly static combos to be effective. But that's a very brief, 10-ish second window of time, and everything about the rest of the fight is still constantly shifting.
Well, the whole rest of the fight outside of that is just doing what you can do to build up that meter to stun him again. So if you the little robot girl, I forgot her name, you're essentially gonna switch to her, use all the skills you can possibly do, use all the attacks you can possibly do, build up the break meter, and I would argue that's more rigid than anything Wuthering Waves does. Because you're literally just sitting there with your stun unit, trying to build it as fast as possible. Once it's stunned, switch to your support to build up the damage, the defense reduction, like from Nicole, and then switch as you on, play her for like 5 seconds of the break, and then switch to the robot girl again. I don't know. I feel like that comparison isn't really that great. I feel like that feels a little bit more rigid. Personally, it feels a little bit more rigid than Wuthering Waves.
Not to mention how much additional variety there is in deciding which combo route to use during stun on the fly based on things like how close you are to freeze, for example, or what phase of the fight you're in. And the problem with Wuthering Waves is that to an extent, entire fights feel like that stun DPS phase, but with less nuance low-key. They're just a matter of pressing the right buttons in the same order as you always do when the enemy you're fighting and their moveset is almost an afterthought as long as you're properly babysitting your cooldowns and concerto. Which is a big part of the reason you're not going to see me quick swapping like Wallenstein anytime soon, because if you're a high skilled player, the input complexity is kind of a non-issue, right? Because this is a fairly simplistic game at the end of the day. But
yes,
as soon
absolutely.
as you clear that barrier of entry, quick swapping trivializes fights even further, because whatever the enemy is doing really doesn't matter. If they're even allowed to move in between all the time slows and freezes, the way swapping tends to reposition you out of the range of attacks on top of all the iframes you get from playing like that mean that as long as you can execute your rotation, there are very few enemies that can really do much to stop you, to the point where realistically speaking, I bet you could easily just blindfold yourself and just roll most bosses that don't have random invulnerability phases as long as your rotation is on point. And after writing that, I looked back up because I was curious, and yeah, it does seem pretty easy. Look at how little the boss fallacy moves. No shade to the creator, it's a cool video, homie is very good at the game, bravo, but everything about this clip is just painful. Because this is exactly why I rarely feel engaged with fights tactically in the same way I am in a game like ZZZ or PoE, and on some level it often just feels like I'm going through the motions in Wuwa. Have you ever been watching some shonen anime where a couple of bros bond over having a conversation with their fist? As silly as it may sound, at face value, I do think a good fight is a lot like a good conversation, and good conversations require input from both sides. With that in mind, ZZZ's gameplay feels like a really engaging push and pull, a heated back and forth debate between you and the enemy.
Yo, if that's the case, if fighting is a conversation, man, the Jane Doe Shadow will not stop yapping. She beats my ass every time. I don't care how many times I fight her. She beats my ass every time.
Whereas Wuthering Waves feels like giving a TED Talk. Hey, maybe it's a really good speech, but it's still mostly a one-sided monologue, so there isn't a single boss I enjoy fighting half as much as Shadow Jane, one of the best conversationalists in the game.
Alright. Okay, he's making a good point. He's making a very good point on that one. I get the TED Talk reference. He's got a point.
So as a result of all this, from a combat perspective, Wuthering Waves just feels kind of dull in comparison to ZZZ, because the push and pull, the friction isn't really there. As soon as the enemy you're fighting and how they choose to respond to your attacks is so much less relevant to your success than simply executing a pristine combo rotation. In the past, I've mentioned one of the guiding game design principles that helped the devs behind Ghost of Tsushima deliver one of the best gaming experiences in history, in my opinion. And I highly recommend their GDC talk. It's a brilliant discussion on what goes into making top-tier melee combat, but one of the parts of that talk that has stuck with me the most over the years was what they described as their #1 rule when it comes to making world-class games. The most effective way to play should be the most enjoyable way to play, and all too often in Wuthering Waves, man.
Without even talking about the Wuthering Waves ZZZ, that should be a golden rule for any game. No matter what genre, no matter what platform, that should be a golden rule for any game whatsoever, hands down.
Managing your cooldowns is such a significant priority, it unironically feels more effective to ignore the enemy in front of you to an extent and just focus on your rotation to optimize your cooldowns and concerto instead. Because if you waste too much time dodging, fishing for parries, or trying to mix up your combos, you'll ruin your damage. And in my mind, that's as much of a design failure for a character action game like this as an open world that locks movement behind paywalls, making it a chore to explore, so you wind up fast traveling everywhere. In fact, if you're a high-skilled player, a lot of fights may as well just be like putting the god of chess, Magnus Carlsen, in a room with like some random member of the local high school chess club. Now, a student might be pretty good, who knows, but they're like never going to be able to keep up with one of the best to ever play the game. Lord knows, before they even sat down, Carlsen probably already had every move he needed to secure a win mapped out in his head, and more likely than not, within the first 2 moves, the game is effectively over already. It's just a matter of him finishing it. Not to imply I'm like even vaguely close to a Carlsen level of skill when it comes to my gaming ability, but the guy's been on my mind lately. Partially because there's been drama at the chess championships. Yes, I am a nerd, shut up. But also because his stance on the state of competitive chess really resonates with the core of my issue with Wuthering Waves combat, because for years, my guy's been walking around saying stuff like this.
Almost since day one, what am I doing here? Like, why am I spending all this time playing classical chess, which I just find, stressful and boring, but,
Now, at face value, that might be a bit surprising to hear from the man who's effectively been the king of chess for like the past decade, and I wouldn't blame you if you just assumed he was, just tired.
That is a bit sad to hear that man say it. I wonder if he ever enjoyed playing it, or if it just kind of died over time.
Burnt out from playing chess his entire life, but that's not really what he's getting at. You see, he's saying all that because classical chess specifically kind of just sucks in a lot of ways. It's a slow, monotonous slog where if you're good enough, everything is predictable to an extent, which I think is why Carlsen described it as stressful, because that level of predictability puts an expectation on you, even if it's a personal one, to perform perfectly, because that's there's always going to be a right answer, and if you're good enough, you should be able to find it. And I think that's a big part of why Carlsen has been a major advocate for playing different kinds of chess, like Fischer Random, where entire backline positioning is shifted around. And when talking about it not that long ago, he said this: "What we're playing is in many ways a purer long-form game than normal classical chess, because you're sitting down at the board and you have to think about it from the very beginning, and it just feels fresh." And that really resonated with me, because that's exactly how I feel about Zenless in comparison to games like Wuthering Waves, Final Fantasy, and Genshin, in no small part thanks to their focus on cooldowns and timers. Those games that choose to restrict their combat so much or pigeonholed into rotations instead of flexible routes feel like boring, pretentious, pinky in the air, no you can't wear those jeans here, what are you, crazy? Classical chess. Because I more or less know what every fight is going to look like before it starts, it's just a matter of finishing it, and the challenge is almost more about your ability to repeat your rotation enough times to win.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. That is a very fair. I mean, it's pretty much the same with a lot of games, but it is pretty fair for Wuthering Waves to just you got your 1-2-3 combo. It is what it is. I mean, that's just how the game is played, unfortunately. But I love it. I love knowing what I need to do before I get in there, and all I got to worry about, instead of just my muscle memory, I just got to worry about and focus on the boss itself.
While on the other hand, Zenless is like Fisher Random, where I know how to play the game, I'm familiar with all the pieces, but every fight feels fresh to an extent, because the way the game is structured, you constantly have to adapt to your available resources as well as your opponent's behavior on the fly to succeed. Despite the game's flaws, though, like I said at the top, I do like Wuthering Waves, and I actually think a lot of its hiccups are potentially kind of easy to address. Even just taking a page out of ZZZ's playbook where Concerto was concerned would do a lot to loosen up the combat variety and help the gameplay feel more cohesive. That's a story for next time, though, because like I said, this is just the first of many discussions about the mechanics in both of these games, and I have so much to say about Concerto, we would easily be here for another 20 to 30 minutes, and don't even get me started on the ecosystem. So for now, all I'll say is, generally speaking, I'm
They need to have
reasonably
an update in
confident that Wuthering
ecosystem.
Waves is comfortably on the road to success. 2.0 is a groundbreaking update, and if they manage to deliver something similar every 6 months or so like they have planned, it's only a matter of time before Wuthering Waves is a kind of unstoppable household name. But here's the thing. Fun open worlds are a dime a dozen, while stylish character action combat remains to this day one of the most underserved genres of gaming. So as happy and impressed as I am to see them doing incredible things with the world of Wuthering Waves, I'm really hoping the combat mechanics continue to evolve in a similar way. Regardless if they do or don't though, I'll be here breaking down how things play out, because like I said, Zenless and Wuthering Waves are two of the best character action games in modern memory, and considering their current trajectory, I'd be surprised if they weren't mainstays for at least the next 5 to 10 years. And considering in so many ways they may as well be two branches of the same tree.
As long as they keep up listening to their player base, I'm sure they will have a fantastic lifespan.
That just happen to sprout in different directions, they're the perfect head-to-head comparison to use as a vehicle for getting to the bottom of the little details, the small imperfections and overlooked master strokes that genuinely define what sets a good character action game apart from a truly great one. So stay tuned, because we're going to keep the conversation going in the next videos. I try to get to the bottom of not just what...
Alright, he had some very good and valid points, honestly. He had some leaning one side, it had some leaning the other side. I feel like he was really spitting some hard facts. Now, like I said, I'm an advocate for both games. I love them both. I've played them both since the beginning. I feel like they're both fantastic games. I just feel like now everybody's allowed to have their own bias, of course. I feel like he does have a little bit more bias, but towards Zenless Zone Zero, but like I said, that's completely justified. And it was a fantastic video. Let me know what you guys think about it down in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I truly appreciate it. I love that my channel is steadily growing. I appreciate each and every one of you that subscribe and comment and interact with the channel. I love it. Don't forget to come and check out his video. Give him a like. He did a fantastic job on this video. Thank you and have a good one. Peace.